On the day of the funeral, the gentle dog suddenly barked fiercely, jumped onto the coffin, and started scratching it continuously. When everyone found out why, they all gasped in shock. Life is never the same when love falls apart, thought Bentley as he walked through the dusty streets of his small town. The air smelled of wet earth, but his heart was dry, cracked like the ground in a drought. He was only 24, but he felt like life had taken more from him than it had ever given. Fernanda, the woman who had been his light for so long, was gone. The relationship had ended, and with it, all the hopes of a happy future. Returning to his hometown wasn't easy. Everywhere he turned reminded him of Fernanda. The shared laughter under the trees in the town square, the walks to the river, the whispered promises that were now just empty words carried away by the wind. But on top of the grief he carried, Bentley had an even bigger responsibility. His mother was sick, and he was the only one who could take care of her. With no job, no money, and a deep sadness that consumed him, Bentley felt like the world was crashing down on him. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the house, broken only by the sound of his mother's coughing from her room, made him feel even more alone. How was he going to move forward? There were no jobs in the town, and every passing day his mother's illness got worse. Bentley knew time was running out. He needed money for medicine, for food, for everything. God, he thought, I need a miracle. One day, while Bentley was wandering aimlessly on the outskirts of town, lost in a sea of memories and worries, he heard a strange noise. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, but filled with pain. He stopped and looked around, trying to find where it was coming from. There, in the middle of some dry bushes, he saw something move. He approached cautiously, and then he saw it, a dog, large, with grey and black fur trembling under the shadow of a tree. Its eyes reflected fear, pain, and desperation. The animal was injured, one of its legs twisted unnaturally, and its entire body was shaking, not just from the cold of the afternoon, but also from the terror of being alone. Bentley knelt down, moved by the sight. "Poor thing," he murmured as he carefully reached out his hand. The dog didn't move, but its eyes followed Bentley's every move, wary but too weak to run away. With patience, Bentley got closer. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, whispering as if he was talking to a friend. Slowly, the dog allowed Bentley to touch it, its fur dirty, covered in dust and dried blood. "Come on, I'll take you home." The walk back was slow. The dog, though hurt, seemed to understand that Bentley only wanted to help. He carried it in his arms, feeling the weight of the animal, and somehow that weight gave him a sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, Bentley felt like he was doing something useful. When they got home, his mother, despite her weakness, looked at him in surprise from the bed. "Another mouth to feed?" she joked, a tired smile on her face. Bentley smiled for the first time in a long time. "This is Rocco," he replied, gently petting the dog's head. "I think we needed each other." Rocco, as Bentley named him, quickly became his inseparable companion. He cared for the dog, cleaning its wounds, feeding it, and soon the dog began to recover. Although he still walked with a limp, his eyes no longer reflected the same fear as before. Now there was a glimmer of trust, an unspoken bond between the animal and its new owner. Rocco brought a new light to Bentley's life. The walks that used to be lonely were now more bearable with the dog by his side. When Bentley went out looking for work, Rocco followed him, limping but always steady at his side. Sometimes it seemed like the dog understood the pain Bentley carried in his chest, as if they shared an invisible wound. Days went by, and even though Bentley still hadn't found work, Rocco's presence gave him the strength to keep going. The nights weren't as lonely anymore. When the silence became overwhelming, the sound of Rocco's breathing at the foot of his bed was comforting. He knew that, although life was still hard, he wasn't completely alone. The morning started like any other, with a cold that cut to the bone, and a timid sun barely peeking over the mountains. Bentley got up early, as usual, and looked over at his mother, who was sleeping in the bed next to his. Her breathing was slow, heavy, like every breath took immense effort. Money was still tight, and the medicine was running out. Bentley knew he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let his mother sink deeper into illness without doing something. "I have to do something, there's no other way," Bentley said to himself as he petted Rocco, who looked at him with those eyes full of loyalty and understanding. It was like he understood everything, as if he shared his owner's worries. That day, Bentley decided to go to the offices of the mining company, the only source of work in his small town. He knew it wasn't the safest job, but he had no choice. The coal mine had been operating for generations, and even though everyone knew the dangers, many men in the village had no option but to work there to support their families. When he arrived at the mine's offices, the smell of dust and coal already surrounded him. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, but Bentley walked in with his head held high, determined. The hiring manager, an older man with skin weathered by the sun and time, looked him up and down before slowly nodding. "There's work, but it's not easy, and it's not for everyone," the man said in a deep voice. "I know. I don't mind hard work. I need this," Bentley replied without hesitation. After a few minutes of questions and warnings, the man finally hired him. "You start tomorrow. Show up early and don't forget your helmet. Down there, life is measured in seconds, and any mistake can cost you dearly." With a signed paper and some quick instructions, Bentley left the office feeling a little lighter. He had gotten a job, but the weight of what it meant didn't escape him. The coal mine was known for its accidents, but he couldn't afford to be afraid. His mother depended on him. That night, as Bentley mentally prepared for what was to come, Rocco stayed by his side, as always. The silence in the house was broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the occasional nudges from Rocco seeking attention. Bentley looked at him and smiled. "Tomorrow's going to be tough, Rocco, but I know you and I can handle it." Rocco, as if he understood, gently wagged his tail and rested his head on Bentley's lap. The next day started long before the sun came up. Bentley dressed in heavy work clothes, an old helmet he borrowed from a neighbor, and made sure he had everything he needed. Rocco followed him to the door, but Bentley stopped him. "Not today, Rocco. I don't want anything to happen to you," he said softly, while the dog looked at him with sad eyes. Rocco, used to going everywhere with Bentley, didn't understand why today he had to stay home. The mine was a dark and suffocating place. The men were already working when Bentley arrived, and they quickly put him to digging and moving rocks in one of the deepest tunnels. Sweat ran down his forehead, and his hands, unaccustomed to the tough work, started to blister. But he didn't complain. He knew that every day of work was another day of life for his mother. As days went by, Bentley became part of the mine's routine. The work was hard, yes, but even worse were the exploitative conditions. The supervisors barely treated them like humans, and the wages were just enough to cover the basics. But Bentley endured because he had no choice. The only thing keeping him afloat was knowing that every penny earned went towards his mother's medicine. Rocco, however, didn't stop accompanying him. Even though Bentley tried to leave him at home, the dog found a way to follow him to the doors of the mine, patiently waiting for his owner to come out at the end of the day. Soon, the other miners began to notice the dog, and Rocco won everyone's affection. They started calling him the mine's guardian dog, and his presence became a regular part of their day, as if he was part of the crew. Time in the mine was strange. The days seemed endless, and the constant sense of danger kept him always on edge. He knew that at any moment, the walls could give way, or a methane gas explosion could end everything. Every time he heard the rocks creak or felt the air grow thin, fear ran through him like a cold chill. The day began like any other at the mine, but there was something different in the air. Bentley noticed it when he left the house. A heavy grey sky hung over the town. and a damp wind hinted at a coming storm. Rocco, who always accompanied him, stayed home, sick and curled up next to Bentley's mother's bed. Bentley petted his loyal friend's head before leaving. "Take care, buddy," he whispered. Even though his heart was uneasy about leaving the dog alone, he had no choice. Work was calling, and the mine didn't tolerate absences. When he got to the mine, the sound of distant thunder rumbled like a bad omen. The other miners exchanged glances, but no one said a word. The work was tough and dangerous, but the silence between them was like an unspoken agreement that whatever happened inside the mine stayed inside the mine. That morning, Bentley was assigned to the ventilation of Tunnel 3, a job that, although routine, required constant attention. He knew the system was old, and the buildup of methane gas was a constant risk. "Do your job and get out of there as soon as possible," he told himself, as he adjusted his helmet and started walking down the tunnel. The shadows stretched out as he moved forward, and the light from his lamp barely lit up the narrow passage. Bentley had made this walk many times before, but that morning, something didn't feel right. The air was thicker than usual, like something invisible was pushing him back. Suddenly, as he adjusted the strap on his helmet, he felt a bump. Something, or rather someone, had run into him. Surprised, Bentley looked up and saw a man. His figure was blurry in the dim light, but it was clear he didn't belong there. The bump was strong enough to make both of them drop the bags they were carrying. Bentley quickly picked up his own bag from the ground, but something didn't add up. According to the work plan for the day, he was the only one assigned to that tunnel. "Who is this guy?" The man, visibly nervous, started mumbling. I was sent to check the electrical system," he said, avoiding eye contact. His voice was shaky, and although Bentley was confused, he didn't have time to question him. The work was waiting, and he didn't want to spend more time than necessary in that tunnel. But the man's behavior seemed strange. Before Bentley could say anything else, the man grabbed his bag and quickly headed towards the tunnel entrance. Bentley watched him walk away, almost running. The echo of his footsteps faded into the darkness until they disappeared. Weird, he thought, adjusting his helmet. But he decided to let it go. He had work to do, and the sooner he finished, the better. He moved deeper into the tunnel. The air was getting thicker, and the unmistakable smell of methane gas began to fill his nostrils. The ventilation system wasn't working properly, and he knew it. As he inspected the valves, he realized the situation was worse than he thought. The methane levels were alarmingly high. One spark, a small source of heat, and everything could explode. As he adjusted the valves with trembling hands, the worry started to creep in. The system was failing, and he knew that if he couldn't fix it, the consequences would be catastrophic. But something kept distracting him, a feeling that he wasn't alone in that tunnel. He remembered the man he had bumped into. It doesn't make sense. He shouldn't be here, Bentley thought. And especially not acting that weird. The air inside the tunnel grew denser, almost impossible to breathe. Bentley could feel the sweat running down his forehead, but it wasn't just from the heat. It was from the anxiety starting to take over. Something wasn't right. He knew it. He felt it in his skin. The rocks above his head creaked, making that subtle but ominous sound, like a warning that the earth was about to give way. As he adjusted the last valve, the change in air pressure became obvious. The tunnel was sealed, and the methane gas was building up. Bentley heard a sound that froze him in place. A faint click, like something had come loose deep within the tunnel. And then, the tremor. It wasn't an earthquake. He knew that much. It was the gas. The methane saturating the air and looking for a way out. Panic flooded him. There was no time. "No, this can't be happening," he thought as he dropped his tools and started running toward the exit. His footsteps echoed on the dusty floor, getting faster and faster. The lamp on his helmet shook with his movement, casting frantic, dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. In the distance, Bentley saw a figure moving. It was the man he had bumped into earlier. He was closer to the exit, but still walking slowly, like he didn't understand the urgency of the situation. "Run! Get out of here now!" Bentley shouted with all the strength he had left. His voice boomed through the tunnel, bouncing off the rocky walls. The man stopped for a moment, looking back, but instead of responding or speeding up, he kept walking toward the exit at a slow pace, like he didn't hear the danger closing in. It was then that the inevitable happened. A violent crack echoed above their heads. The lamp, hanging precariously on the wall, slipped off its hook and crashed to the ground with a burst of glass. Bentley, still running toward the exit, heard the sharp sound of the glass breaking, and at that moment, he knew. The accumulated methane gas had found its spark. A second later, a deafening roar shook the tunnel. The explosion was as fast as it was devastating. The hot air hit him from behind, pushing him forward with brutal force. Bentley barely had time to throw himself to the ground, covering his head with his arms as fire and dust surrounded him. A sharp, piercing scream cut through the noise, but it wasn't clear whose it was. All Bentley could hear after that was the roar of the fire consuming everything in its path. The tunnel began to collapse. Tunnel 3, which for years had been a witness to the tireless work of the miners, had now turned into a death trap. After the methane explosion, the rocks that had once formed a solid ceiling started to give way, collapsing one by one, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow up the men who dared to venture into its depths. The news didn't take long to reach the town. A devastating accident at the mine. And with it, a heavy silence fell over the community. Bentley had disappeared. Rescue teams arrived quickly, knowing that time was against them. For hours, they moved tons of debris, hoping to find any survivors, but as they went on, hope began to fade. Among the dust and smoke, they finally found a body. Burned, unrecognizable, the skin charred and the clothes torn apart by the heat. Beside it was an even more disturbing object, a fire-resistant bag, and inside, Bentley's identification. That was all they needed to know. The news spread through the town like wildfire. Bentley was dead. Tragedy settled into every corner, like a shadow covering the light of the sun. Mothers hugged their children, fearing for those who still worked in the mines, and neighbors exchanged words in hushed tones, with the respect that only death can command. He was a good boy, some said. He didn't deserve this end, others lamented. But words offered no comfort to a mother who had just lost everything. Bentley's mother, an elderly and sick woman, couldn't believe it. Losing her son was such a devastating blow that her fragile heart could barely take it. She felt like she was sinking into a darkness that seemed endless. "My Bentley," she murmured over and over, her voice breaking while she held the last photo she had of him in her hands. "Why did you take him from me, God?" She asked the air, but there were no answers. Rocco, Bentley's loyal companion, couldn't rest either. From the moment his owner didn't come home, the dog had started acting strangely. For hours, he would bark non-stop, running back and forth as if he knew something that no one else could understand. The neighbors, worried about the dog's agitation, advised the family to lock him up so he wouldn't cause more disturbance. "It's the grief," they said. "Animals feel the loss, too." But Rocco wasn't just grieving. He knew something wasn't right. The day of the funeral arrived. Grey clouds covered the sky, threatening rain, as if nature itself was mourning Bentley's passing. The small-town church was full of people, all dressed in black, their faces heavy with sadness and sorrow. The bells rang slowly, marking the start of the ceremony. Bentley's family, heartbroken, tried to find comfort in the priest's words, but the pain was overwhelming. "May God have him in his glory," said Father Joaquin with a solemn voice as the attendees bowed their heads in respect. When the time came to carry the coffin to its final resting place, someone, suggested they let Rocco loose. "Let him say goodbye to his master," one of the neighbors suggested. As soon as they let go of the leash, the dog ran with desperate speed towards Bentley's coffin. But what happened next left everyone perplexed. Rocco began scratching at the wooden coffin vigorously, his paws moving frantically while he growled and barked in a way that wasn't normal. It was as if he was desperately trying to say something. The people watched him with confusion and a bit of fear. "What's wrong with the dog?" they murmured. "Why is he acting like that?" Attempts to calm him down were useless. Rocco wouldn't stop, his agitation growing more intense. "Rocco, stop!" a voice called from the crowd, but the dog wouldn't listen. He seemed possessed by a determination no one could understand. Finally, a young miner, a close friend of Bentley, cautiously approached the dog. "It's like he's trying to tell us something," he said, watching as Rocco kept scratching at the coffin. He decided to kneel down, trying to calm Rocco, but as he did, he noticed something strange. The dog wasn't looking at the coffin like he was searching for his owner inside. It was more like he was trying to draw attention somewhere else. "Something's not right," the young man murmured, feeling a strange unease in the air. The young miner, still crouched next to Rocco, started to feel a growing sense of unease. The dog wouldn't stop barking, his eyes fixed in a direction opposite to the coffin, as if he knew something the others didn't. "What are you trying to tell us?" he thought, glancing at the other people at the funeral, all with confused and worried faces. Rocco, visibly agitated, pulled away from the coffin and began tugging at the young man's pants, urging him to follow. "Hey, something's not right." "I'm going to follow Rocco," said the miner, quickly getting to his feet. At first, Bentley's family and friends watched in silence, skeptical, but the intensity of the dog's barking convinced them. One by one, several began to follow, as the dog urgently led them toward the edge of the cemetery. The afternoon was already fading, and the shadows of the mountains began to stretch across the horizon. Rocco didn't slow down, his tail straight and ears perked, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The group walked quickly, filled with a fear they couldn't explain, but certain that something more was about to happen. Among them was Bentley's mother, supported by the arms of two neighbors. She stayed silent, with a mix of hope and pain in her eyes. She kept her gaze on Rocco, as if the dog was the only connection she had left to her son. The dog led them straight to the entrance of Tunnel 3, where the terrible accident had occurred days before. The area was still cordoned off, with warning signs prohibiting entry due to the risk of further collapses. But Rocco showed no hesitation, running to a specific spot right over a section of the tunnel that hadn't been fully cleared yet. Rocco began to dig at the ground, right where the largest rocks blocked the entrance. The young miner who had followed the dog from the cemetery knelt down and pressed his ear to the ground, trying to listen. At first, he only heard the echo of his own thoughts, the heavy silence that enveloped the abandoned mine. But then, like a distant whisper, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A weak moan, barely audible, was coming from beneath the rocks. The young man jumped up, his eyes wide. "Someone's alive!" he shouted desperately. "We need to move these rocks, quick!" The group, initially doubtful, reacted with a mix of surprise and relief. The few miners present didn't waste any time and began moving the rocks by hand, not waiting for tools or machinery. "We don't have time. He might be hurt," said one of the workers as he lifted a rock heavier than his own body. The minutes felt endless as they dug and cleared away the debris. The weak moan, just a faint thread of a voice, kept them going, giving them the strength to keep pushing. "Don't give up, Bentley," one of the miners whispered, convinced his friend was still alive. Finally, after what felt like hours of fighting against the stones and dust, they managed to clear a small opening. One of the men shone his lamp into the hole, and there, among the debris, they saw an arm. It was motionless, covered in dust and dried blood, but when the beam of light touched it, it moved slightly. "It's Bentley!" one of the rescuers shouted. "He's alive!" The entire group was overcome with a mix of joy and panic. They knew they had to act quickly, but also carefully. The mine was still unstable, and one wrong move could cause another collapse. Gently, they pulled Bentley out from between the rocks. He was weak, barely conscious, with his skin covered in cuts and bruises. His breathing was slow and painful, but he was alive. Bentley's eyes opened slightly. His gaze was distant, confused, but when he saw Rocco, the dog who had stayed by his side, wagging his tail nervously, a faint smile appeared on his battered face. "Rocco," he murmured, his voice cracked and barely audible. "I knew you'd come for me." The young miner, who had followed Rocco from the start, knelt beside Bentley and took his hand. "Don't worry, brother. We've got you. You're safe now." Bentley closed his eyes, exhausted from the ordeal of surviving such a tragedy. But inside, he felt a sense of peace. He knew he had been on the edge of death, but something, or rather someone, had kept him alive. The bark of his dog, the loyalty of his most faithful friend, had pulled him out of the darkness. "Rocco saved me," he thought, before losing consciousness completely. As Bentley was rushed to the town hospital, news of his rescue spread quickly. The neighbors couldn't believe it. Many cried with relief, while others simply gave thanks in silence. For everyone, it was a miracle. The boy who had been presumed dead was alive, thanks to the dog, who never stopped believing he'd return. That night, Rocco didn't move from the hospital entrance. He sat there, firm, as if guarding the door, waiting for his friend to come out. The nurses who passed by looked at him with tenderness, knowing this dog had done more than many humans ever could. He had saved a life with his unwavering loyalty. A few days later, Bentley opened his eyes in a quiet hospital room. The first thing he saw was his mother, sitting beside him, tears in her eyes. On the other side of the bed, Rocco was lying down, his head gently resting on the sheets, watching over his master as he always did. "Mom," Bentley murmured, trying to smile. "I can't believe I'm here." "Thanks to God and to Rocco, son," his mother said, gently holding his hand. "He never stopped looking for you. He saved your life." Bentley looked at Rocco, and in that moment, he understood everything. His dog hadn't just pulled him out of the rubble. He had brought him back to life. Bentley stayed in the hospital bed, his body still aching from the collapse, but his mind was far from resting. The last week had been a nightmare, but he couldn't shake the shadow of the man he had encountered in the tunnel. That mysterious worker who had fled just before the explosion had vanished without a trace. Or so Bentley thought. As he stroked Rocco's head, Bentley tried to piece together the puzzle in his mind. The blow to his head had blurred some memories, but one stuck clearly: the strange man and their accidental exchange of bags. What was that guy doing in the mine? He kept asking himself. The murmur of doctors and nurses in the hallway brought him back to the present. The small town hospital had always been a quiet place, but since his rescue, it had become the center of attention. Everyone was talking about the tragedy at the mine, about how he had miraculously survived. However, Bentley knew the real story was yet to be uncovered. The next day, with more strength and clarity in his mind, he decided to check the bag he had picked up in the tunnel. "This isn't mine," he murmured to himself as he carefully pulled out the contents. Among several worn mining tools and some papers, Bentley found a small black notebook covered in dust and coal stains. Something about it told him this notebook held important information. As he opened it, the first few pages were filled with meticulous notes, written in small, hurried handwriting. Bentley squinted as he read the words. Illegal activity, gas explosion, bribes. His heart started to race. This isn't just a work log, he thought. It's a record of something much bigger. With each page he turned, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The man he had crossed paths with in the mine wasn't just an ordinary worker. The notes revealed that he was an undercover investigator, gathering evidence on the corrupt practices of the mining company. The working conditions were intentionally dangerous, with faulty safety systems, all to save money. Worst of all, the supervisors knew about the risks and still forced the miners to keep working. Bentley closed the notebook, his hands shaking. "That man, the one they found burned," he whispered, looking at Rocco, who remained faithfully by his side. "It wasn't me they thought was dead. It was him." Now he understood why they had found his ID next to the charred body. In the chaos and confusion of the moment, they had switched bags. He was carrying my documents, and I had his notebook. The weight of that revelation left him cold. The man had sacrificed his life to expose the truth, but his mission wasn't over. Now it was Bentley who had the evidence needed to reveal the company's wrongdoings. The door to the room opened, interrupting his thoughts. It was the doctor, accompanied by his mother. "Bentley, son, you have visitors. Someone wants to talk to you." Behind the doctor, a middle-aged man stepped in, dressed formally. He had a serious expression and looked at Bentley with a mix of curiosity and respect. "I'm Officer Mendez from the State Police," he said as he approached the bed. "We heard about your rescue and about the accident at the mine. How are you feeling?" Bentley hesitated for a moment, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had to tell the truth. "Officer," he began, his voice a bit shaky, "I think there's something you need to know. The man who died in the explosion, he wasn't just another worker." The officer looked at him intently, leaning slightly forward. "What are you talking about, Bentley?" Bentley reached over to the bedside table where he had left the notebook. He picked it up carefully and handed it to Mendez. "This notebook isn't mine. I found it in the mine, in the bag of the man I ran into before the explosion. He was an undercover investigator, and he was gathering evidence about the company's illegal activities." Mendez frowned, taking the notebook in his hands and quickly flipping through the first few pages. As he read, his expression grew more serious. "This is serious," he murmured. "Very serious." He closed the notebook with a snap and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I'm going to look into this further, Bentley. Thank you for trusting me." Bentley nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew giving the notebook to the police was the right thing to do, but he also feared the consequences. The mining company had power and influence in the town, and challenging them could put him in danger. Days passed with an apparent calm in the town, but deep down, everything had changed. The notebook Bentley had handed over to the police sparked an investigation that shook the foundations of the community. The dark secrets of the mining company began to come to light, and what had been whispered among workers for years was now a loud cry for justice. News of the abuse and exploitation in the mine spread quickly. Officer Mendez and his team worked tirelessly, questioning miners, reviewing documents, and receiving reports from former employees who, upon hearing what was happening, finally found the courage to speak up. Rumors of inevitable accidents and deaths that had been buried under the coal dust were now being treated for what they really were: deliberate negligence. Bentley, still recovering, followed every development in the investigation from home. The days of rest were long, but the constant presence of his mother and Rocco kept him going. "You're not alone, son," his mother would say, sitting beside him every morning with a warm cup of coffee. And Rocco, always faithful, never left his side, as if he knew that the journey they had started together wasn't over yet. One afternoon, while Bentley was looking out the window at the town square, he saw a group of miners gathering around a newly posted notice. He got up, leaning against the window frame, his body still weak, but his mind full of questions. What's going on now? He wondered. He called Rocco, who was already watching him with attentive eyes, and together they slowly walked to the square. When they arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The faces of the miners, hardened by years of work and suffering, showed a mix of anger and relief. One of them, an older man named Don Luis, handed Bentley a piece of paper they had torn from the notice. "Take a look at this," he said in a grave tone. "It's about the investigation." Bentley read the words printed in bold letters. The mining company had been shut down indefinitely while the investigations continued. The owners were being prosecuted for multiple offences, including criminal negligence and labour exploitation. Additionally, the government had ordered compensation for all affected workers, and there were promises that safety conditions would improve dramatically in the future. The entire town breathed a sigh of relief that they hadn't felt in a long time. The mine, which for years had been both a source of life and death, was finally closed. But for Bentley, the closure of the mine was just the beginning. He knew there were still deep wounds to heal, not only in his own body but in the hearts of everyone who'd lost someone in those dark depths of the earth. That night, as the lights of the town slowly faded, Bentley sat in front of the fireplace in his home. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but his thoughts were still a mix of sadness and gratitude. All of this, it all started with that encounter in the tunnel, he reflected. If I hadn't switched that bag. But he knew he couldn't live in the past. What had happened was a tragedy, but it was also an opportunity for the town to change. Rocco, as if sensing Bentley's emotions, came over and rested his head on Bentley's knees, letting out a soft, comforting whine. Bentley smiled and stroked him. "You brought me back, buddy. You gave me my life back when I'd already thought it was lost." As the days went by, Bentley began to heal, not only physically, but also emotionally. The scar on his head was a constant reminder of what he had been through, but it was also a sign of his resilience. Little by little, Bentley reintegrated into the life of the town, though no longer as the young miner he once was. The locals looked at him with respect, not just for surviving the tragedy, but for bringing to light the truth that had been hidden for so long. One morning, while walking through the market with his mother, several townspeople approached him to thank him. "Thank you for not giving up, Bentley," said an older woman whose husband had lost his life in the mine years ago. "Thank you for making sure our voices were finally heard." Bentley smiled humbly and replied, "I didn't do it alone. It was the help of all of you, and the bravery of the man who risked his life to bring the truth to light. I just followed the path he started." Time passed, and with it, the town began to transform. The mines remained closed, and new opportunities started to emerge. Families who had relied on that dangerous work for generations found other ways to make a living. The memories of the tragedy were still there, but so was the hope for a safer future. As for Rocco, he had become a beloved figure in the town. The kids called him the hero dog, and they always came over to pet him when they saw him walking beside Bentley. For many, the story of how the dog rescued his owner from the depths of the earth had turned into a local legend, one of those stories that would be told for generations. Now, fully recovered, Bentley knew it was time to do something more with his life. "I can't stay stuck in the past," he thought, as he looked at the horizon. "It's time to build something new, something better, for myself and for others." He decided to use the compensation money to start a community project, a place where the town's youth could learn new skills, far from the dangers of the mines. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could help make the future different for those who came after. As the months went by, Bentley became a key figure in rebuilding the town, not just physically, but also in lifting the spirits of the people. His courage and determination inspired many not to give up, to keep fighting for a better future. And so, Bentley's life, once marked by pain and tragedy, transformed into a story of hope and renewal. Every time he walked through the streets of the town with Rocco by his side, he knew they had overcome the worst, and together they had managed to rise from the darkest abyss. The story of Bentley and Rocco was not just a testament to survival, but also to loyalty, courage, and the certainty that even in the hardest times, there is always a light that can guide us to a new beginning. The story of Bentley and Rocco is a deep testimony to the unbreakable bond between a human and his loyal animal companion. Throughout their journey, we see how Rocco's loyalty and love become the spark that keeps Bentley alive in his darkest moments. Rocco is not just a dog. He's a symbol of hope, intuition, and pure devotion. Through his instincts, Rocco demonstrates an extraordinary ability to save his owner, acting when everything seemed lost. For his part, Bentley represents the human struggle against adversity. His life in the mines reflects the reality of many who face unfair and dangerous conditions. But his story is not only about physical survival, it's about the ability to endure emotionally and morally. Bentley's courage in exposing the truth about the mining company shows that justice and integrity are essential pillars, even if they come at a cost. The lesson this story leaves us is the importance of the bonds we form, both with other humans and with animals. It reminds us that love, loyalty, and courage can help us overcome even the greatest challenges.